In an instant, children run for their lives. Desks overturn, books scatter, and screams echo through the halls. Teachers shout for order, desperate to shield their students, as a normal day in school becomes a desperate fight to survive. Some of the worst crimes in history didn't happen in back alleys. They happened inside classrooms. Attacks so violent, they left nations in shock, families broken, and scars that time could never erase. And it all began in America, when two students walked into their own school carrying guns and homemade bombs. No one knew that day that classmates would unleash one of the most brutal massacres in the nation's history. Columbine High School Massacre. April 20th, 1999. A spring morning in Littleton, Colorado, turned into one of the darkest days in American history. Two seniors, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, arrived at Columbine High School armed with shotguns, semi-automatic weapons, and homemade explosives. For months they had been preparing for this moment. Their plan wasn't just a shooting, it was mass murder on a scale no one had ever seen inside a school. They planted propane bombs in the cafeteria, timed to explode during lunch and kill hundreds instantly. When the devices failed, they moved to Plan B. At 11:19 a.m., dressed in black trench coats, Harris and Klebold opened fire outside, targeting students eating lunch on the lawn. Then they stepped inside. Hallways turned into hunting grounds as panic erupted. The library became the center of horror. Dozens of students hid under tables while the two gunmen stormed in. For 7 long minutes they mocked, taunted, and murdered 10 of their classmates. Elsewhere, teachers locked doors, whispering for silence as gunshots rang through the halls. Some students escaped by smashing windows and jumping from the second floor. 911 calls from inside captured every scream, every shot. By 12:08 p.m., less than an hour after it began, it was over. 13 people were dead, 12 students and 1 teacher. More than 20 were wounded, and the two killers ended their rampage by turning their guns on themselves. Columbine wasn't the first school shooting in America, but it was different. It was calculated, cold, and broadcast across the world. It changed police tactics, school security, and even the way the media reported violence. And tragically, it inspired others who wanted to follow the same path. And yet, years later, another American school would be attacked, and this time the targets were children barely old enough to speak in full sentences. Sandy Hook Elementary School Massacre. It was a quiet Friday morning in Newtown, Connecticut, December 14, 2012. Inside Sandy Hook Elementary, young children filled their classrooms just days away from winter break. The holiday season was beginning, but within minutes, it would become one of the darkest days in American history. 20-year-old Adam Lanza had already killed his own mother at home, shooting her with one of the guns she had legally purchased. Then, dressed in black and carrying a semi-automatic rifle, along with hundreds of rounds of ammunition, he drove to Sandy Hook. Shortly after 9:30 a.m., Lanza forced his way inside by shooting through a glass panel near the entrance. Within seconds, he began firing. The first to fall were staff members who rushed to confront him. Then he moved deeper into the school. Teachers scrambled to protect their students. Some locked doors, others pushed children into closets, and a few threw themselves in front of bullets. But Lanza's attack was merciless. In just a matter of minutes, he murdered 20 children, all between 6 and 7 years old, along with 6 staff members who tried to shield them. The youngest victims were barely old enough to read. The rampage lasted less than 11 minutes. By the time police closed in, Lanza turned the gun on himself, but the damage was already done. Outside, parents waited in panic. Some were reunited with their children. Others were left standing in shock, clutching photos their worst fears confirmed. The town of Newtown was devastated, and the images from that day, tiny desks left empty, lines of children escorted out with their eyes covered, remain among the most haunting in modern memory. Sandy Hook wasn't just another school shooting. It was a massacre so horrific that it reignited debates across America about guns, mental health, and safety in schools. But for the families, no law or policy could erase the pain of losing children so young. Columbine had been about planning. Sandy Hook was about pure horror. And tragically, another American community would face its own nightmare. Not from a shooter with a rifle, but from a man who turned a school into a bomb. The Bath School Disaster, May 18, 1927. In the small farming community of Bath Township, Michigan, parents sent their children to school like any other day. They had no idea they were about to witness the deadliest school massacre in American history. The man behind it wasn't a student. He wasn't even a stranger. He was Andrew Kehoe, a local farmer and treasurer of the school board. Outwardly, he was known as a stern but ordinary man. But underneath, Kehoe was consumed by anger. Struggling financially and furious over rising taxes, he blamed the school and the community for his problems, and he plotted his revenge with chilling patience. For months, Kehoe quietly planted explosives beneath the Bath Consolidated School. Using dynamite and pyritol, he rigged the basement with enough firepower to level the building. On the morning of May 18th, Kehoe set his plan in motion. First, he killed his wife at home and wired his farm with explosives, ensuring that it would burn to the ground. Then, at 8:45 a.m., a massive blast tore through the school. The north wing collapsed instantly, trapping and killing dozens of children inside. Survivors described the scene as total chaos: smoke, rubble, and screams as parents rushed to pull bodies from the wreckage. As rescue efforts began, Kehoe drove up in his truck, loaded with even more explosives. With cold precision, he detonated it, killing himself and several others, including the school superintendent he despised. When the smoke cleared, the toll was staggering: 38 children and 6 adults dead, with dozens more injured. Entire families were shattered in a single morning. The Bath School disaster was unlike anything the nation had ever seen. It wasn't just a shooting, it was mass murder by explosives, carried out by a man trusted in the community. Nearly a century later, it remains the deadliest school massacre in US history. And yet, decades later, another school would once again be turned into a crime scene, this time in Germany, where a single gunman walked into his former school and opened fire. The Erfurt Massacre. The school day at Gutenberg Gymnasium in Erfurt, Germany, had barely begun when the first shots rang out. At first, some thought it was fireworks or a prank. Within minutes, it became clear: someone was hunting through the halls. The gunman was Robert Steinhäuser, a 19-year-old former student. Once quiet and unremarkable, he had recently been expelled for forging a doctor's note to skip classes. The expulsion meant no diploma, no job prospects, and in his mind, no future. Humiliation turned to rage, and that rage grew into a plan for revenge. Steinhäuser returned to the school armed with a shotgun and a pistol, both legally obtained. He was dressed in black, his face hidden under a mask. Unlike most attackers who fire indiscriminately, his targets were chosen: teachers, administrators, and anyone he saw as responsible for his downfall. He moved with chilling precision. Bursting into classrooms, he ignored the students and focused on the staff. Teachers were shot at close range. A trainee policeman who rushed to intervene was gunned down instantly. Within minutes, panic swept through the building. Students locked doors, hid under desks, and cowered in silence as footsteps and gunfire echoed through the halls. For nearly half an hour, Steinhäuser stalked the corridors. By the time he was confronted, he had murdered 16 people, 13 teachers, 2 students, and 1 officer. The confrontation came from a single teacher who stepped into his path. Face to face with the gunman, she told him calmly, "You can shoot me, but you cannot pass." Something in her words broke his rhythm. Instead of continuing the slaughter, Steinhäuser retreated into a classroom and turned the gun on himself. The massacre left Germany in shock. Entire classrooms were missing teachers the next day. Survivors spoke of frozen fear, of hours hiding in locked rooms, not knowing if they'd live. The country responded by tightening its already strict gun laws and introducing new security protocols in schools. But for the families of Erfurt, no law could undo the devastation. Their children returned to school buildings that felt more like crime scenes than places of learning. And tragically, Erfurt was not Europe's last school massacre. Years earlier, Scotland had endured its own nightmare, when a gunman walked into a primary school and opened fire on dozens of children. The Dunblane Massacre, March 13, 1996. In the small Scottish town of Dunblane, A primary school became the scene of the deadliest mass shooting in the United Kingdom's history. The attacker was Thomas Hamilton, a 43-year-old former scout leader. Years earlier, parents had raised concerns about his behavior with children, leading to his dismissal and growing resentment toward the community. Isolated, bitter, and consumed by paranoia, Hamilton turned his anger on the most vulnerable target imaginable, a school full of children. That morning, he arrived at Dunblane Primary, armed with 4 handguns and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Just after 9:30 a.m., he entered the gymnasium, where a class of 5- and 6-year-olds were beginning their day. Without a word, Hamilton opened fire. In less than 4 minutes, 16 children and their teacher were gunned down. Others were wounded, some critically, as the gym filled with smoke and screams. Staff rushed to lock classrooms, pulling children into corners, desperate to shield them from the bullets. The entire attack ended when Hamilton turned one of his own guns on himself. The massacre shocked the United Kingdom to its core. The idea that so many children, barely old enough to read, could be slaughtered in their own school left the nation reeling. Funerals lined the streets of the small town, grief overwhelming a community that had never imagined such violence could touch them. Dunblane left a legacy that went beyond mourning. The outrage sparked sweeping changes to British gun laws, leading to some of the strictest firearm regulations in the world. To this day, Dunblane remains a turning point, the moment a nation decided it would never allow such a tragedy to happen again. But across Europe, years later, another school would face its own nightmare, not from a middle-aged man seeking revenge, but from a student who turned his classmates into targets. The Kerch Polytechnic College massacre. The first explosion shook the halls. Students screamed, desks flipped, and smoke filled the corridors of the Kerch Polytechnic College. Moments later, the gunfire started, and it became clear this wasn't an accident. The attacker wasn't an intruder. He was one of their own. 18-year-old Vladislav Rozlyakov had been walking these halls for years as a student, but on October 17, 2018, he returned carrying a shotgun, pockets filled with ammunition, and homemade bombs in his backpack. For months he had been preparing, studying past massacres, and idolizing Columbine. He even dressed in the same long coat and gloves as Harris and Klebold. At first, no one noticed him, but then he opened fire. Classrooms erupted in chaos as Rozlyakov moved through the building, blasting anyone in his path. Survivors described a wave of panic, students leaping from windows, others cowering under desks, the air thick with smoke from the explosives he set off. The college became a war zone in minutes. By the time emergency services stormed the building, the carnage was overwhelming. 20 people lay dead. Dozens more were injured. And in the middle of the bloodshed, Rozlyakov ended the massacre by turning the gun on himself. The attack stunned Russia. School shootings had always been viewed as a Western problem, but the brutality at Kerch showed otherwise. Investigators later confirmed what many suspected. Rozlyakov had modeled his massacre on Columbine, proving how far the influence of that tragedy had spread. For the survivors, the scars were permanent. For the nation, it was a grim awakening. That even within its borders a teenager could transform his school into a battlefield. But Kerch was not the first time Europe had seen a student turn against classmates and teachers. A decade earlier, Finland had already faced horror inside its schools. Attacks carried out by young men who believed they were destined to leave their mark in blood. The Jokela school shooting. The town of Tuusula, Finland was quiet on November 7, 2007. At Jokela High School, students were moving between classes when the first shots rang out. Within minutes, a calm Nordic town was thrust into chaos. The gunman was 18-year-old Pekka Erik Ovinen, a student at the school. Pale, withdrawn, and obsessed with violent ideologies, he spent much of his time online posting about natural selection, hatred for humanity, and his fascination with previous massacres. Days before the attack, he uploaded disturbing videos to YouTube, posing with a handgun and declaring that he would eliminate the unfit. Few took it seriously. That morning, he carried a semi-automatic pistol into the school. At 11:40 a.m., he began firing. Students ran through hallways, some smashing windows to escape, while others hid inside locked classrooms. Smoke filled the corridors as Ovinen ignited fires to spread more panic. He moved with chilling intent, shooting anyone he encountered. By the time the attack ended, 8 people were dead: 5 students, a nurse, the principal, and finally Ovinen himself, who turned the gun on his own head. The shooting shocked Finland, a nation with one of the highest rates of gun ownership in Europe, but little history of school violence. Jokela was a turning point. It exposed how the culture of school massacres had crossed borders through the internet, inspiring killers thousands of miles from where the phenomenon began. For survivors, the memories never faded. For the country, the tragedy sparked debate about firearms, mental health, and the growing influence of online extremism. But the horror wasn't over. Less than a year later, Finland would be struck again by another young gunman, this time at a university, determined to outdo the carnage of Jokela. The Kauhajoki school shooting, September 23, 2008. Not even a year after the massacre at Jokela, Finland faced another nightmare, this time at a vocational college in the town of Kauhajoki. The gunman was 22-year-old Matti Sari, a student at the school. Like Pekka Erik Ovinen before him, Sari was quiet, withdrawn, and deeply disturbed. He too spent hours online, posting videos of himself posing with guns, firing at targets, and talking about hatred for humanity. He idolized previous school shooters and wanted to leave his own mark in blood. That morning, Sari walked into the Seinäjoki University of Applied Sciences, carrying a pistol and nearly 200 rounds of ammunition. Dressed in black, he moved quickly through the campus, firing at students in classrooms and hallways. He didn't just shoot, he set parts of the building on fire, filling rooms with smoke and chaos as panicked students tried to escape. Survivors later recalled crawling through windows, running barefoot into the streets, and choking on smoke as gunfire echoed behind them. Teachers tried to shepherd students out, but the attack was relentless. By the time it was over, 10 students were dead. Sari, like Ovinen before him, ended the massacre by shooting himself. The similarities between Jokela and Kauhajoki were chilling. 2 young men, both alienated, both obsessed with violence, both inspired by the same dark online culture. For Finland, the back-to-back massacres were a devastating blow. A country that once seemed far removed from this type of violence was now at the center of it. And across Europe, the echoes of school shootings kept spreading. In Germany, a teenager would soon launch his own attack, not with bombs or rifles, but with a pistol and a plan to turn his classmates into victims. The Emsdetten school shooting, Germany, November 20th, 2006. At the Geschwister Scholl school in the town of Emsdetten, a 45-minute lesson was underway when a blast shook the building. Smoke filled the halls, and suddenly gunfire followed. Students and teachers scrambled for cover. The school was under attack. The gunman was 18-year-old Bastian Bosse, a former student who had dropped out after years of feeling isolated and bullied. Angry at the world and obsessed with weapons, he had been posting online rants filled with violent fantasies. In the days before the shooting, he wrote that he wanted to leave a mark, and on that morning, he put his plan into action. Armed with a shotgun, smoke grenades, and improvised explosives, Bosse stormed his old school. He moved through the halls firing at random, injuring several students and staff. Smoke bombs went off inside classrooms, filling the air with choking fumes and forcing people to smash windows to escape. In the chaos, teachers locked doors and pushed furniture against them, desperate to protect their students. Police swarmed the area, but by the time they reached Bosse, the attack was already ending. The gunman had shot himself. Miraculously, no one besides Bosse died that day, but more than 30 people were injured, some by gunfire, others by smoke inhalation and broken glass. For Germany, it was yet another warning sign. A generation of disillusioned young men, radicalized online, were turning their frustrations into violence at schools. The scars of Emsdetten lingered, but it wouldn't be the last. In the years to come, Europe would see more classrooms turned into crime scenes, including a brutal attack in Canada, where a quiet suburban town was stunned by violence in its own school halls. The Tsawwassen school attack, Tsawwassen, British Columbia, a peaceful suburb just outside Vancouver, where schools felt safe and crime rarely made the news. That changed in May 2000, when a high school was suddenly thrown into chaos by one of its own students. The attacker was just 16 years old. Armed not with guns, but with a machete and homemade firebombs, he had spent weeks preparing his assault. Classmates later recalled he had grown increasingly withdrawn, angry and fascinated with violence. But no one imagined he would bring it to school. That morning, he stormed the halls swinging the machete, striking students and staff at random. At the same time, he hurled Molotov cocktails, setting parts of the building on fire and filling corridors with smoke. Panic spread instantly. Students ran for the exits, some slipping on shattered glass as flames and screams echoed around them. Inside classrooms, terrified teenagers shoved desks against doors, crouching low and praying they wouldn't be next. Teachers shouted for calm, some pulling children to safety, while others stayed behind, risking their lives to distract the attacker. The rampage left several students and staff injured, some seriously, before police finally intervened and subdued him. Though no one was killed, the violence scarred the community. Parents flooded the school in shock, horrified that a machete attack and homemade bombs had been unleashed in what was supposed to be a quiet, suburban high school. Unlike Columbine or Sandy Hook, the Sulwassen attack didn't dominate international headlines, but for those who lived it, the terror was unforgettable. A single teenager had turned their safe space into a battlefield, proving that school violence could take many forms, not just guns. And while Canada was left shaken, Europe would soon face its own string of nightmares, including a Finnish bombing that tore through a school and reminded the world just how inventive and devastating these attacks could be. The Raumanmeri school bombing. In the coastal city of Rauma, Finland, classrooms were just beginning their day on January 2, 1989. At Raumanmeri school, the sound of the morning bell was suddenly replaced by something no one expected, an explosion that ripped through the building and left the air filled with smoke and screams. The attacker was a 14-year-old student. Angry, isolated, and fascinated with destruction, he had built his own explosives at home and smuggled them into the school. Unlike shootings, which often leave a clear trail of warning signs, this was different. His classmates had no idea he was capable of making bombs, let alone bringing them to school. The blast tore through a crowded hallway, sending glass and debris flying. Students ran in panic, stumbling over each other as they tried to escape the smoke and flames. Teachers rushed toward the chaos, pulling children out of the danger zone while others tried to calm those frozen in fear. When the smoke cleared, one student lay dead. More than 40 others were injured, many from shrapnel and burns. For a small Finnish town, the scale of destruction was shocking. Parents who had kissed their children goodbye that morning now stood outside a school-turned-crime scene, desperate for answers. The Raumanmeri bombing became a grim reminder that violence in schools didn't always involve guns. One teenager with homemade explosives had managed to devastate an entire community. For Finland, it was a precursor to the school shootings that would strike the nation decades later. But Finland wasn't the only country left grappling with violence in its schools. Across the world, in the United States, a university campus would soon become the site of the deadliest school shooting in modern history, a massacre that left 32 lives lost in a single morning. The Virginia Tech shooting. April 16, 2007. Blacksburg, Virginia. What began as an ordinary Monday on a college campus would end as the deadliest school shooting in modern U.S. history. The gunman was 23-year-old Seung-Hui Cho, a student at Virginia Tech. Known for his silence and social isolation, Cho had a history of disturbing behavior. Professors had flagged his violent writings, and classmates were unsettled by his refusal to speak. Behind closed doors, his paranoia deepened. He saw enemies everywhere, and in his mind, Virginia Tech became the stage for his revenge. The massacre began early, just after 7 a.m., when Cho entered a dormitory and shot 2 students. But what followed was even worse. 2 hours later, as the rest of the campus carried on unaware, he chained the doors of Norris Hall shut, trapping hundreds inside. Then he began moving room to room, armed with 2 handguns and carrying hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Inside Norris Hall, panic exploded. Students tried to block doors with their bodies. Others leapt from second-story windows to escape the gunfire. Professors used themselves as shields, buying seconds for their students to survive. In one classroom, a Holocaust survivor named Liviu Librescu held a door shut against the killer, giving his students time to climb out of the windows before he was shot dead. The horror lasted only 11 minutes, but it felt endless. Cho fired more than 170 rounds before finally turning a gun on himself as police closed in. When it was over, 32 people were dead, and more than a dozen were wounded. Virginia Tech was unlike anything America had seen before. The scale of the killings shocked the nation and the world, forcing colleges everywhere to re-examine security and emergency responses. But for the families, the statistics meant nothing compared to the lives lost. Sons, daughters, classmates, and teachers who never came home. The tragedy left behind haunting questions. How a young man so visibly disturbed had been able to buy firearms, how warnings were missed, and why no one stopped him before it was too late. Virginia Tech stood as the deadliest campus massacre in US history, but it would not be the last. 15 years later, another American school would be thrown into chaos, and this time it was elementary children once again, trapped in their classrooms as police waited outside. The Robb Elementary School Massacre, May 24, 2022. In the small town of Uvalde, Texas, the last days of the school year were supposed to be filled with summer excitement. At Robb Elementary, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th graders were finishing their lessons. But by the afternoon, the school was in lockdown, families were in chaos, and the nation was in disbelief. The gunman was 18-year-old Salvador Ramos, a former student of the school. Just days after his birthday, he purchased 2 AR-15-style rifles and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. His social media posts were filled with dark hints, but no one imagined what he was about to do. Shortly after 11:30 a.m., Ramos shot his grandmother at home, then drove to the school. Crashing his truck into a ditch nearby, he emerged heavily armed and began firing at anyone in sight. When he reached the school building, he forced his way inside. He entered 2 adjoining classrooms and immediately opened fire. Children and teachers screamed as bullets tore through the rooms. Some students played dead to survive. Others called 911 in whispers, begging for help. In those 2 classrooms alone, Ramos killed 19 children and 2 teachers, leaving survivors with lifelong trauma. But what made Uvalde even more infamous wasn't just the massacre itself. It was the police response. Nearly 400 officers from multiple agencies swarmed the scene, yet for more than an hour they waited in the hallway, heavily armed, while children trapped inside called for help. Body camera footage later revealed officers retreating from gunfire, choosing not to advance as the victims bled. At 12:50 p.m., over 70 minutes after Ramos first entered, a tactical team finally stormed the classroom and shot him dead. By then, the damage was irreversible. Families outside the school screamed in grief and rage, some forced to provide DNA samples to identify their children. The Uvalde massacre was one of the most devastating failures in modern American policing. It sparked national outrage, endless investigations, and a grim reminder that even with overwhelming force, hesitation can be deadly. For the survivors of Robb Elementary, trauma will last a lifetime. For the families of the 21 victims, no justice will ever replace what was lost. And while Uvalde reignited debates in America, school massacres were not confined to the United States. Across the world, in China, an attacker would storm a school with a knife, proving that even without guns, a single individual can bring terror to a classroom. The blood is washed away, the classrooms rebuilt, but the echoes remain. Screams that once filled hallways still hang in memory. Families who buried children carry wounds that time doesn't heal. The massacres ended in fire, smoke, and blood. But the memory lives on, louder than the violence, heavier than the fear, and impossible to erase.